Today's episode is brought to you by FAMM. Have you heard about FAMM? I've been running FAMM, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, for a couple of years now. It's a mentorship program specifically designed for women's health professionals looking to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool with their clients. Not only does FAMM prepare you to teach fertility awareness to your clients, but by combining the science with the practical application of charting, it allows you to support your clients by monitoring their fifth vital sign in a standardized way. Enrollment for FAMM only opens once per year. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive to join the waiting list and be the first to know when early bird registration opens for next year's class of 2024. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 460. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with over 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormone health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I have been consistently outspoken about hormonal birth control over the past 2 decades and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys and a brand new baby girl. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. Today I'm sharing a brand new episode in my FAMM Research Series. I'm tackling a very interesting and kind of controversial topic. The research study that I will be reviewing today is an actual review on the question of whether or not the contraceptive pill, hormonal contraceptives, alter our choice of partner. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. Before I get into the study itself, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this phenomenon. Many of you may have heard of this phenomenon before, whether it's in passing or just the kind of talk that goes back and forth between girlfriends. But basically, many of you may have heard that the pill can change the way that you perceive your partner's scent. And so whether we are aware of it or not, all of us have a bit of a scent. It's that whole concept of pheromones and this whole thing that's going on below our conscious awareness of how we might choose a partner and how attractive someone might be to us based on how they smell. And I've thought about this a lot, given that I've been aware of this topic for quite some time. And I think that there's definitely something there that's below our level of conscious awareness in many cases. But either way, this is what the topic is about. The question is, does the pill affect our choice of partner? And is it possible that if we are on the pill when we meet a new partner, that if we were to come off that pill, could it change the way that we perceive that person? And so the answer is possibly. And that can be very disconcerting to people. I know that when you talk about different aspects of hormonal contraceptives that are either questionable or potentially negative, there's always someone that comes out of the woodwork and accuses people who talk about it accuses us of discouraging women from using the pill or scaring women about it, or everyone knows that that's nonsense or whatever. But does everyone know that that's nonsense? When I was researching for the fifth vital sign, what I discovered was this rabbit hole of environmental biology that looks at human beings and their choice of mate, their response to different hormones. And this question has been looked at in a number of different ways. It's been looked at from the question of, will women who are off the pill prefer the scent of different men compared to women who are on the pill. It's looked at from the standpoint of actually looking at genetic markers in different people and determining how similar or dissimilar a person is genetically from you, and whether or not you would prefer that partner based on their scent. And so this is termed the major histocompatibility complex, MHC. And that's a fancy term for the genetic compatibility between partners. When you get into the weeds with this stuff, basically what they're saying is we would have a natural affinity to choose a partner that is fairly dissimilar to ourselves from a genetic standpoint. And this is happening under the level of conscious awareness. But when we are getting in those intimate settings with a partner, depending on how they smell to us, that is one of the ways that we naturally choose partners who are genetically similar. And from that evolutionary biology perspective, that would be one of the ways that we are selecting mates that for breeding purposes. So we're really getting into the weeds here, but this is how they're looking at it. So it's a really interesting field of science to read these types of papers and from their perspective, all of those kinds of things. But what it boils down to is that they're saying that their theory is that as human beings, we have a natural propensity to choose partners that are favorable to us for reproductive purposes. And it's not something that we're consciously aware of. It's happening below the surface. And a lot of that is based on the way that we perceive our partner's scent. Okay. So I mentioned there's a couple different ways that they've studied this. And in addition, they've also looked at women's mate choice across the menstrual cycle. And for anyone who is tracking their cycle, you already know that there's different hormones that we're producing in different amounts at different parts of the cycle. And when we are in that pre-ovulatory phase, or particularly in our fertile window, that part of the cycle is characterized by the highest estrogen production. And that has been correlated with a lot of really interesting things when you dig into the weeds with this research. A number of studies have found that women's level of sexual desire goes up, frequency of sex, and those kinds of things around that time. And there's interesting research suggesting that women may be more likely to choose a genetically different partner around that time. And of course, their hypothesis is that this would help us to make better babies or something like that. But there's a number of studies, surprisingly, that have been done around this concept that do show these kind of interesting results. And on the flip side, in addition to, as women, how we might perceive a partner scent or how that might affect how we would choose a partner, there's also these studies that test men and find that men tend to find women more attractive during that ovulatory phase. And they do all kinds of interesting studies where even in some studies, they found that men prefer the sound of a woman's voice more in that fertile window kind of point of the cycle. And I cited a really interesting study in the Fifth Vital Sign where they call it the stripper study. And in that study, they actually had a group of strippers that were on hormonal contraceptives versus a group of strippers who were not. So we have the cycling normally and the not cycling because they're on contraceptives. And the strippers who were cycling normally, they actually experienced an increase in the amount of tips that they received in the middle of their cycle when they were in that fertile window. And between that difference between outside of that fertile window and in the fertile window, that increase in tips resulted in them making more money compared to the women who were on the pill. So, I mean, it's an interesting study. Maybe I'll do a separate research episode on that at some point in the future, because that study is interesting enough to have its own episode. But I mean, it's just a really interesting field. So this, I hope, is an interesting introduction to this concept, and just this, so that you know that it's a real thing. I think that's the first piece of it, so that that it's not just this fringe thing where there was one random study, and it's actually this whole rabbit hole. And there's many, many, many studies in this area that examine this question in different ways. And not all of the studies are looking particularly at the pill. A lot of the studies are just looking at the changes across the menstrual cycle and how these hormones interact and how they could affect the way that we're choosing partners and things like that. But when we do introduce the question of could the pill affect this, a big reason that this ends up being studied is because when a person is on hormonal contraceptives, when a woman is on the pill, she's no longer cycling. So she's no longer experiencing that regular fluctuation, increase in estrogen, all the different changes that are happening before ovulation because she's not ovulating. So a lot of those changes that would naturally happen in the cycle are not happening. And that prompts the researchers to look deeper into this. So getting back to this review study, does the contraceptive pill alter mate choice in humans? This study is just looking at a lot of the research that has already been done and posing that kind of question of what does this all mean? Where are we at now? What do we know about this so far? Where could we research more in the future? So it's a really interesting overview of what's going on. And so, as I mentioned, there's a couple different points, but if any of you have ever heard of the t-shirt studies, so again, there's different ways that they study this. One of the t-shirt study is essentially they will get men to wear t-shirts for a period of time and then get women to smell them. So there's that. But it's not necessarily that simple. When you look at some of these studies, they're delving into not only, it's not just random men either. They're testing these individuals for genetic markers. And there was one study that I was looking at where they found men that were similar genetically to these women versus men who were not similar, so dissimilar to them genetically. And they would have specific men wear these t-shirts and they would compare, are these women choosing different men at different times of their cycle? And does it change if they're on contraceptives? And so a lot of these studies show that women are more likely to choose a genetically dissimilar partner when they're in their fertile window, and women who are not cycling normally, who are on the pill, are often more likely to choose genetically similar partners. There's other studies that look at a woman's preference for what they term more masculine men. So they'll choose these different features on the face and they'll actually feminize the faces of men and put them, it sounds bizarre, but it's really interesting. So I'm going to keep going. But they'll present women with different looking men and look at these signs for masculinity. And so there's all these interesting things that they found. And one of the things that they found is that women who are on contraceptive pills tend to be more likely to choose men who don't necessarily have a lot of those predominantly masculine features. So it's not necessarily conclusive per se, but what they're finding is that the pill does seem to have some sort of effect on how we are perceiving either the scent of men or the overall presentation. And so in some cases, obviously not all, many of these women, there's enough studies that have been done and research to suggest that at least in some cases, the pill can alter the type of partner that you may choose. So if I read from the study, it says women prefer, so this is just what the researchers are saying here. Women prefer more masculine, symmetrical, and genetically unrelated men during ovulation compared with other phases of the cycle. And recent evidence suggests that men prefer ovulating women to others. So they're kind of starting off by saying, generally speaking, these are the kinds of features that women tend to prefer. And this tends to be more pronounced when they're in that fertile window. And the same thing goes for men, where they tend to have a preference for women just in general who happen to be in that fertile window. And this is something, if you've ever talked to girlfriends about this or noticed, I've certainly had some interesting conversations over the years with a variety of girlfriends, given the nature of my work. But there is this thing where for women who are not on contraceptives, who are cycling, if you pay attention, whether it's N of one in your own personal relationship and how your partner responds to you at different times of the cycle, or whether you're out there in the dating world and you pay attention to how men respond to you kind of like out in the wild, it's a real thing. A lot of women do find that this is how it is. And even if you're in a relationship, if you start and you're not on contraceptives, if you start paying attention to how your partner relates to you at different times of the cycle, it's really interesting because you may find that there is a pattern similar to what these researchers are finding. And so they go on to say, new evidence is now emerging that taking the oral contraceptive pill might significantly alter both female and male mate choice by removing the mid-cycle change in preferences. So, I feel like in this context, they're really looking at how taking away that cyclical, just that natural cyclical nature and how that could affect the preferences and all of those things across the cycle, how that is removed for women who are taking the pill. After reviewing a lot of the data, much of which I've talked about, the different preferences, whether it's for the features that they're defining as masculine, when they're showing women a variety of different photographs and altered photographs of men, when they're looking at the T-shirt studies, when they're testing how the pill can change the way that women perceive the scent of their partners, and how that can relate to the genetic similarity or dissimilarity of men. When we're looking at what this study is concluding, what they're saying is the trend that they're seeing in the research, that I'll read from what they're saying. They're saying there is emerging evidence that the use of the pill by women can disrupt the variation in mate preference across their cycle, their attractiveness to men, and their ability to compete with normally cycling women for access to mate. So again, you got to think about this within the context that they're researching, the context that they're looking at it. They do talk a lot about this concept of competing for partners. So they're saying there's an effect on women in terms of how they might choose a mate, but there's also an effect that is out of their control, which would be how a man might choose them. And so they're basically saying women who are naturally cycling have potentially this natural advantage because there's a point of their cycle where they may be more likely to draw men to them. So it's all really interesting. Like I said, it does get into the weeds. But the question, I suppose, that we want to ask, how does this relate to us, is what does the study tell us and what does this really mean in the most practical sense? And I think that it's interesting because it doesn't really mean anything conclusive. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're on the pill, you've chosen the wrong partner and, all of that kind of stuff. But there are situations, although I wouldn't say they're necessarily overly common, but there are situations where if you have been on the pill for a long time and you meet your partner and you've never really, been with this partner while you have been on the pill, there are situations where some women find that when they're ready to come off the pill, let's say they're ready to start trying to conceive, or maybe they're switching to a non-hormonal birth control method, there have been situations where women come off the pill and find that their partner has this scent that they just never even noticed before, that they didn't perceive before. And I think that is really one of the scariest possibilities that comes out when discussing this specific issue. The question of whether or not you could be dating someone and in love and all of that, and then you come off the pill and all of a sudden you're kind of like, wow, I'm not as attracted to you as I was before. And that would be devastating. And so again, I don't know how common of an experience that is, but what the research tells us is that it's even if it's a small possibility, it's a possibility for some people in relationships. And I think particularly when they have met their partner while still on contraceptives. And what I've heard a lot from a lot of women, I think it's also really common for a lot of women to meet their partner and then go on contraceptives for birth control purposes. And so a lot of women do have that experience, which is different, but it is worth thinking about and worth considering. And I suppose in the general sense as well, what does the study tell us? Well, it tells us that the pill modifies our natural state of being. I mean, but we should know that if you're taking a drug that's preventing you from conceiving by suppressing ovulation, and that by doing that is changing your natural hormone cycle and basically stopping your natural hormone cycle, then it should stand to reason that there could be consequences that go beyond what we would initially think about. I think that it's really interesting how cavalier our culture has become about hormonal contraceptives. They're just so common. They're so blasé even. And I often say that many women on the pill don't even really consider it to be a medication just because of how our culture has made it just so common that we don't even think about it. Just like you wouldn't really think about it if you're taking vitamins or something like that day to day. most women who are on the pill don't even consider it to be a medication. And when asked if they're taking any medications, they don't even list it as a medication because they're not even thinking about it. Popping into today's episode with a quick question. Do you like paper charting? Today's episode is brought to you by the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. This is the first beautifully designed, fully customizable paper charting workbook designed with you in mind. With 3 years worth of charting pages, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook has you covered. If you've been looking for a solid alternative to charting apps, you'll love this charting workbook. The FAMM Charting Workbook is available in both Fahrenheit and Celsius editions and is available in spiral-bound, paperback, and ebook versions. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workbook to order your copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/workbook. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. So I think studies like this remind us that there is more going on here than meets the eye. And again, the purpose of this episode is not to scare anybody or anything like that, but just to have this conversation. Because I always go back to this point that when we talk about things like that, there are always people who come out of the woodwork and want to accuse people like me of trying to fearmonger women for not taking the pill. And that's obviously not what I'm doing. However, if there is research showing that the pill can affect mate choice and can change how we perceive the scent of our partners and how this could play out in different situations, different scenarios, I mean, we should know about it. We should know that that research exists. We should be able to talk about it. We should be able to have conversations about it and just put it out there and have a dialogue. And it shouldn't be this thing where because we're so scared that someone might not want to take the pill, we're going to not be honest about what the research is showing us and what the implications are. And if you from that evolutionary perspective that the researchers are coming from, they're suggesting ultimately that if our choice of partners is altered, that it could affect the offspring. So if you take it away from human beings and put it out to, I don't know, hyenas or cheetahs or something, they're looking, I mean, the animal kingdom is wild. I don't know if you watch any of those animal shows. I watch them with my kids a lot, and you see this whole, it's crazy, it's lawless. And these males will come in and kill all the babies of the previous male who wasn't as strong as them to preserve the genetic superiority of the, so this is the, so we got to put it in context, right? This is where they're coming from. This is what they're thinking about. And so this is what the underlying suggestion is. The underlying suggestion is that if our natural pickers are being messed with, then we might not be choosing the same men or having the same reproductive success. Now, again, we can't extrapolate that from the data. There's literally not enough evidence to suggest that this even has that negative of an effect. And there hasn't been enough, as far as I can see, research into this to make any conclusions. So I'm definitely not saying that, but the implication is there. And so if anything, it's a really interesting area to research, and there should be more. It should be an area that continues to be looked at, and there should continue to be research studies, and we should continue to learn more about it. And if anything, I think it just speaks to the fact that we should be having a conversation about contraceptives, and we should be thinking about how we prescribe them to women, and potentially being a little bit more judicious. The way that it is now, it seems like most doctors want all women on contraceptives from the age of 14 onwards. If any woman complains about a irregular period or acne or PMS or pain or basically anything related to menstrual cycles, they are immediately suggested the contraceptive pill, regardless of whether they're sexually active. And these off-label uses have become almost more normal of use than the actual contraceptive piece of it at all. And it's highly recommended for women to basically be on contraceptives for their entire adult lives, except for the short periods of time that they might want to be trying for a baby. And I think that it's worth having conversation about that and asking whether this drug really is harmless and whether it would make sense to expand the different options that are discussed and made available to women, so that instead of having a whole generation of young women feel that if they're not on the pill, they can't get pregnant at all, that we talk to them about the various options and then allow them to come to their own conclusions. So I'll just conclude this thought today by saying that whenever I talk about side effects related to contraceptives, I like to put it into perspective, because I think that first of all, I think that informed consent is necessary, and we should be made aware of all of these potential side effects. And we should know that there are studies that do show us that there is a difference, that at least in some of the research, I think that, actually, let me take a look, because they had an interesting stat in this study here. It says, during the past decade, 75% of studies investigating women's cycling mate preferences have demonstrated that women seek specific characters when fertility is maximal. Ovulating women prefer more masculine and symmetrical male features. So that's interesting, because the majority of the studies are showing that there is a difference. Women choose different partners at different times of their cycles. So that stands to reason that women who are not cycling may be choosing different men than if they were cycling. And that is all we're saying. That's all. And simply, I'm not even, I'm saying it, but I'm saying it because the research is saying it. And so with that in mind, we should be able to have a conversation about that. And some women are going to hear that and think, okay, that's too much for me. I'm going to, look at a different option. I don't really want to be on hormones. So some women will make that choice. Absolutely. But I think a lot of women, if not most women, hear that information and they will still choose the hormonal methods for the times in their lives when it makes the most sense, but they might choose to change their use a little bit. So maybe instead of using it for the full, 10, 20 years, their entire reproductive lives, basically, they may choose to use it for a shorter period of time, or they may choose it at specific times, making it so that it's not just this blanket thing that they're using for 10 years straight. And other women will use it for just as long. And I think there's no wrong decision in there. We all should have the right and access to make those calls, to make those decisions. But what I would prefer is to be able to have that conversation about it. There's one last thing I want to mention about the study, because I did see something that irritated me. And one of the things that was written in the study word for word, I'll read it. The oral contraceptive pill used by 100 million women of reproductive age worldwide changes the hormonal state of the menstrual cycle by, quote, mimicking pregnancy. So if you've been following me for any period of time, you'll know that that's just not true. The pill does not mimic pregnancy. And if you were to look at the hormonal state of a woman on contraceptives, so if you were to do a blood draw and measure her natural levels of estrogen and progesterone, so not the synthetic hormone that is in it, the synthetic estrogens and progestins that are in the actual pill itself that would show up in her bloodstream. But if you were to measure her own hormones, her own estrogen, her own progesterone levels, and see where they are at while she's on the pill, you would find that her levels are very, very, very low, because the pill suppresses ovulatory function, and that therefore significantly reduces her own natural production of these hormones. So if you were to compare then her natural hormone production while she's on contraceptives to if you were to compare her natural levels to any other natural state, right, to say, by them saying, oh, it mimics pregnancy, you would find that the state that most closely mirrors the state of her on the pill would be menopause. Because in pregnancy, the level of estrogen and progesterone that a body is naturally producing is really, really high. And in fact, when a woman is pregnant, by the time she reaches about 40 weeks pregnant, so towards the end of the pregnancy, her progesterone levels are more than 10 times what they would be in any given menstrual cycle. So to say that the pill mimics pregnancy is just a complete false, it's heresy, but it's just completely false. It's actually just not true, because the hormones, the only way you can even pretend that would be true is if you're trying to say that the synthetic hormones in the pill are anything like pregnancy. And it's not even true if we look at her own hormones. And if you think about it from a different perspective, also, it makes sense, because a lot of women on the pill struggle with low libido and painful sex and vaginal dryness and stuff like that. And that is not a thing for women who are pregnant. That's a thing for women who are going through menopause and often who are having issues with hormonal imbalances at that time, right? So So just to state, that was just a side note because I thought it was interesting that this researcher said that twice. And I think that also is a nice reminder to us that research studies are written by human beings who have biases. And so we have to watch for the biases that come up when they're actually interpreting the results, because you can have two different people looking at the same information and interpreting those results very, very differently based on their own inherent biases. Okay. So to conclude today, I really wanted to touch on this topic of, does the pill change our choice of mate? Does it have an effect on all of those things? Again, we don't have a 100% strong, conclusive result, really. But what we do have is quite a bit of data that would show us that there is a change, that hormonal contraceptives do have an effect. And it's very possible that to some degree, it could mess with our natural picker, I would call it. So our natural on subconscious level, how we're choosing people who we're attracted to, there is a possibility that it could be messing with that. So I will let you ponder and consider that. If you are wanting to have a look at the study that I was talking about today, you can head over to fertilityfriday.com/460. And if you're enjoying the research series and you're wanting to kind of catch up on some of those episodes, you can head over to fertilityfriday.com/research. And if you're thinking about joining FAMM next year, so the class of 2024, so that's the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, then you can head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLive, FAMMLIVE, for additional details about that and how to join the waiting list. So I will leave it there. I hope you have a wonderful weekend whenever you're tuning into this show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.